So this is the final panel of today's symposium, but not the final conversation that we're going to have about these issues. It's clear that these issues and these stories, there's much to be told and much to learn. Today's final panel is on sovereignty in the 21st century. Those of you who have been with us all day already had the pleasure to meet Larry Wright when he delivered the opening blessing. If you haven't been here all day, you can quickly know that he's an enrolled member of the Ponca tribe of Nebraska, served as tribal chairman for 11 years, and is now the executive director of the Congress of American Indians, which is the oldest, largest, and most representative American Indian and Alaska Native organization serving the broad interests of tribal governments and communities. Larry is a military veteran, a former social studies teacher, and previously ran a general contracting business. His compatriot on the panel is the Honorable Bryan Newland, currently the United States Assistant Secretary of the Interior for Indian Affairs. Be kind to Bryan. He has been in a hearing all morning, being interrogated by the Senate Appropriations Committee about the Indian Affairs budget. So we're going to have Larry start first so that Secretary Newland can get back with the idea here. Assistant Secretary Newland is a citizen of the Bay Mills Indian community, where he recently completed his tenure as tribal president. Prior to that, he served as the chief judge of the Bay Mills Tribal Court. He served as counselor and policy advisor to the Assistant Secretary of the Interior for Indian Affairs, a graduate of Michigan State University and the Michigan State University College of Law. He enjoys hiking and kayaking along the shores of Lake Superior and is a nature photography enthusiast. So we are honored to have these two distinguished leaders with us today, and we will start with Mr. Wright.
Thank you, Jane. I should have known better. When you asked me if I needed anything, I wanted to go first instead of following all these great people. But no. Aho, Ponkamashe, Lashwahan, De Huanoche, Larry Wright Jr., Ijajik Debdi, Wishti, Usni Ponkabdi. I said, hello, my name is Larry Wright Jr. My Ponca name is Buffalo Spirit, come from the Buffalo clan, and I'm a citizen of the Ponca tribe in Nebraska. It's an honor to be here on behalf of National Congress of American Indians, and I say thank you on behalf of our president and our executive committee. It's a real honor to be here and talk about this subject and be part of it. The National Congress of American Indians just celebrated our 80th anniversary, and NCAI was born out of the fact that, as you heard here all morning, the attacks on tribal sovereignty, and even though the Snyder Act was about 20 years old at the time, those attacks were still coming at that time. It was formed during the era of the termination period, which is near and dear to my heart. My people were terminated, one of the last tribes terminated, of 109 in 1964. And we were federally reinstated in 1990. But the work of NCAI, and we heard from different organizations, has ebbed and flowed over the years, but at the heart of our mission, it's still true today, is defending sovereignty on all its fronts and making sure that as the oldest, one of the oldest organization representing Indian country, it's our job to make sure that we elevate the voice of our tribal nations, and working with our sister organizations like NARF that you heard from this morning, but also working with folks like Bryan, and we give him all the props in the world and the work that he's doing to help ensure Indian country is represented fairly. And so when we officially, NCAI is a nonpartisan organization. We have to work with everybody. And when we elevate this voice and we talk to members of Congress and administration and different agencies, we need to make sure that we talk to everybody and we elevate the voice of Indian country. And it takes on a lot of different things. We do a lot of education, outreach, making sure that people understand the issues that Indian country faces. And so when we talk about defending tribal sovereignty in all of its forms, and that has grown in nature because the attacks on tribal sovereignty have gotten more sophisticated, and they continue to evolve, and we see this more and more. And as everything changes in the country, and we get in, as we're talking about the 21st century, how tribes operate today is very different than it was obviously at our beginning, or going way back to the Snyder Act itself. And so we need to make sure that we change with the times too, and we help tribal governments in all our forms be able to adjust to the changing dynamics of Congress, the administration, the country, economics, all of the issues that face our tribes, and making sure that our tribes will continue to be here moving forward, just like NCAI, and we're working for the next 80 years. And so from a tribal government standpoint, having that voice and making sure that our tribes are protected, especially in this digital age that's affecting tribes very differently. We still continue to have a digital gap in our country. We have tribes that on their reservations don't have access to broadband, internet, and that puts them at a disadvantage. And when we look at the importance of that, and as we get into this age of AI and making sure that as things become more and more digital, as they are, we have a digital sovereignty issue that we need to protect. We need to make sure that our tribes are protected on that front, and there's attacks and taking cultural aspects of our tribal traditions, culture, language, and our proprietary items. So we need to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to help make people aware of what that is, and just like it would be the reservation ground itself. And so we look at all of those kinds of things from NCAI. We're primarily a policy institute. We help shape that policy. Our member tribes pass resolutions, just like the Congress does, and those are our marching orders. And so collectively, that's built on a consensus level. And so when the tribes vote on that to tell NCAI this is the direction we want to go, that's the direction that we take, and we move forward. And I would say since the start of NCAI 80 years ago, there have been over 4,400 of those directions given to NCAI. And so there's a lot of work that goes on, and our tribal nations are very engaged on many different levels. And we want to make sure that we protect them and defend sovereignty all in every direction that it goes. From a personal level, when you talk about this, and I'll go back and put my tribal chairman hat on, recovering chairman, and when we look at the difference, for my tribe, as I said, we were terminated, and it took an act of Congress to say that was wrong. And when we look at that, and so just in this little over 30 years, my tribe has been in nation building. We had to build everything back up. So when our tribe was terminated, all of our land was sold off, and that was divided up amongst the adults in the tribe. And we lost everything. We were forcibly removed to Oklahoma in the late 1800s. And, this year, as we celebrate this 100th anniversary, it was 145 years ago that Indians weren't even considered humans in this country. It took a case in 1879 that involved one of our chiefs, Chief Standing Bear. And when we were moved to Oklahoma, when his son died, or before his son died, he made his dad promise to come bury him in our homelands in Nebraska. And several months later, after he passed away, 30 of our people left in the middle of the night in January and made it all the way back to Nebraska. And the military finally caught up with them, and the orders were to march us back down to Oklahoma immediately. Long story, but ultimately, Standing Bear sued the federal government, and particularly General Crook. And the whole premise of the case was that it shouldn't go to court because Indians were not considered humans in the eyes of the U.S. law at that time. And so the outcome of that case was, after the judge read the dictionary, said, yes, Indians are humans, according to the dictionary, and we were allowed to stay. And so when we look at that, 145 years just to be considered humans, to the 100th anniversary of the Snyder Act, we have a lot of things that are not that far apart. And I know there was a lot of talk earlier about our military service. And my great-grandfather served in World War I, and every one of my relatives have served. And one of the reasons why I joined. But when we look at that commitment from Indian country before we were even considered citizens, and it's been well said, that's the kind of commitment and the importance of the Snyder Act itself. But when we look at the importance in the 21st century and how things have changed, a lot of things have changed from that digital age, but how we interact with our government agencies. And so as a tribe, ourselves trying to reestablish our sovereignty and fighting for our rights, it took a lot of education. Working in my tribe in particular, we're in 3 states, Nebraska, Iowa, and South Dakota. And so we have 3-state political dynamics. And for a long time, as we fought for just getting things back, we spent a 16-year battle fighting to have our land put in trust and be able to game on it. That was a big economic driver for us, but it took 3 different presidential administrations to finally make that happen. And just as we continue to fight, even the misunderstanding of how our tribal governments work. And I had a governor that we were talking to at the time, and she said, well, why are you doing this now? Your predecessor said you were never going to do this. And I said, well, Governor, with all due respect, that would be like me saying, you have to do everything your predecessor said from the other party. And she sat back in her chair and she goes, nobody's ever told me that. And it was a couple months later that we got approved. And so, we continue to fight and educate. And like many of the things that were shared here this morning, sometimes politicians, when they get to office, that's the first time they hear about Native issues or even some of these things in the past. And so, again, one of our main roles at NCAI is to help educate and make sure that people do know what those issues are. So as they legislate, they don't leave us out or they don't make bad legislation that affects us negatively. But those things are continually happen. And this last year, one of the biggest court cases in Indian country had to deal with the Indian Child Welfare Act and defending that law and making sure that our Native children stay with their Native families. That was one of the biggest cases where 500 different tribes and organizations came out and supported that Supreme Court decision. And we were very fortunate to get the decision that we did. But we know that that's not the end. We know that there's already new attacks on that, and we'll continue to fight on that level. And so when we look at this, the Snyder Act itself, and when we talk about today, especially in the right to vote for Indian tribes, is more crucial today than ever. And so when we continue to talk about the importance of being engaged as a citizen, as a U.S. citizen, and what that means to us, but also from a tribal level, making sure that we're voting for people who understand our issues and are willing to defend those issues and willing to legislate for those issues. And it doesn't matter what party that is. And so we want the best people to represent us. And that is a continual thing that we do. We're very fortunate with this administration that they've done many things to help strengthen sovereignty in Indian country. And that starts with the consultation process. So we're working with agencies before decisions are made, and we're at the table. There's a saying in Indian country, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And we found ourselves on the menu quite a bit. And we want to make sure we're at the table moving forward, working with people like Assistant Secretary Newland and others, so that when laws are passed, they have the voice of Indian country and our best interest at heart as well. I'll stop there. Are you recouped?
I'm ready.
All right.
Ani Buju, Minogijip. I know I've had a chance to speak at a number of conferences and events over the years, and the after lunch session is always hard because everyone's slipping into their food coma. And so I appreciate you guys bearing with us. My name is Bryan Newland. I am a proud Bay Millionaire, as we call ourselves, a citizen of the Bay Mills Indian community in northern Michigan. And I'm proud and privileged and honored to serve as the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs at the Department of the Interior, particularly under the first Native person to ever serve as a cabinet secretary in the history of this country, Deb Haaland. Yes. I want to say miigwech, thank you to the U.S. Capitol Historical Society for hosting this event today in the Native American Suffrage Symposium to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Snyder Act. I saw on my way in here, I don't see him in the room, one of my predecessors, Kevin Gover, who I think you all heard from earlier. We all, no matter where we work, we are all standing on the shoulders of the people who came before us. And I certainly am standing atop Kevin's shoulders. He did incredible work in an even much more challenging environment when there were very few Indian people working in this town, and so I'm very grateful to him for his leadership. I also, now many years ago, was a Udall congressional intern through the Udall Foundation, and I worked here in the Russell SOB, I think they called it, for Senator Levin. And so I haven't actually had spent a lot of time back here, so it's nice to be back. And I want to acknowledge a couple of folks here, and I'll talk about their work here in a minute, but Joaquin Gallegos, one of our leading policy advisors in our office, the Assistant Secretary, is here, and Connie Sosi Daharo is here as well. Connie works with our Congressional Affairs team and recently came over to us from the Senate and has spent a lot of time up here on Capitol Hill. And I think you guys all know how, you get, when you serve in this job or as chairman or executive director, you get to stand up here at the podium, but the work is a team effort. And Joaquin and Connie are just instrumental to so much of the awesome stuff we've been able to do. And I'm really proud to be their teammate. Thank you. So a century might seem like a long time, but it's a small period when you look back across history. That history is, whenever we talk about history, it was not so long ago. And since the birth of our country, the federal government has really struggled with how to deal with us. And a lot of times that's how it was approached. How do we deal with the Indians? And how to engage with us, not only as Indian people, but as citizens of sovereign nations. And I think you all have discussed a lot today how there's been a long road to protect the political status of Indian tribes and American Indian and Alaska Native people. And combating disenfranchisement has often gone hand in hand with changing the public narrative that Indians are not equal, that we're less than, as you heard Larry talk about his ancestors. And I want to just briefly talk about two special people who helped to change that here in the United States, who deserve to be spotlighted. One is Tlingit leader Elizabeth Peretrovich, who was instrumental in passing the Anti-Discrimination Act of 1945 in Alaska. Before her work, public places in Alaska were free to post signs in their windows: no dogs, no natives, and openly discriminate against Indian people from accessing public facilities and housing. And there's no doubt that Elizabeth's experience attending a federal Indian boarding school informed her life and her leadership. Another person I want to mention is Miguel Trujillo from Isleta Pueblo. Even after 1924, New Mexico prohibited Indian people from voting based on its state constitution. Along with Felix Cohen, who worked at the U.S. Department of the Interior and was a giant in federal Indian law, Miguel successfully sued the state of New Mexico, where the court ruled that the prohibition against Indians voting was unconstitutional under the 15th Amendment. The courage of those two, along with so many others, has ultimately led to the development of leaders in Indian country who have energized not only tribal nations, but the United States. Up here on Capitol Hill, that includes Senator Ben Nighthorse Campbell, Congressman Tom Cole, Sharice Davids, Congresswoman Mary Peltola, and as I mentioned, former Congresswoman and now Secretary Deb Haaland. For his part, President Biden has made appointment of Indian people in the federal government a priority. That includes more than 80 American Indian and Alaska Native people in senior administration roles here in the federal government. That is unprecedented, and I think the president deserves a lot of credit for that. I know that there are some folks in the room who have been around DC for a long time, and I just want to sit on that point for a second, because I'd mentioned Kevin Gover, but there are others here who understand that to be a Native person in government up until very, very recently was a really lonely endeavor and required enormous emotional labor. To be the only Native person in your agency trying to help shape federal policies and the things you have to hear, the subtle indignities that you just endure every day when you are, leading change in halls of power that never welcomed you before. So it's a real point of pride for me to serve in an administration under a president who has lived out his commitment to make sure the government represents America and all Americans, including American Indian and Alaska Native people. And that power of representation has allowed us to reshape the U.S. trust in treaty relationship. And I want to highlight 4 ways that we've been trying to do that. First, the president has literally put his money where his mouth is when it comes to Indian country by investing $45 billion in just 3 years into tribal communities. That's a lot when it comes to Indian country and Indian people. We've got a long way to go, but I don't want to gloss over that. We are now at, as I was testifying this morning, historic levels of annual appropriations for federal agencies like the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So even at a historic level of funding of $3 billion per year, through laws like the American Rescue Plan, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the Inflation Reduction Act, the president has put 15 years worth of our record agency funding into Indian country in just 3 years. And even with that progress, though, we need to strengthen public safety resources in Indian country, especially when it comes to protecting Native women, girls, and the LGBTQ community in Indian country. And that means funding to the actual level of need and ensuring that our law enforcement officers and our social workers and everyone else who is working to make our tribal communities safe have the tools they need to prevent violence and crime. Second, we're self-reflecting in our work to address how the federal government has harmed Indian people, Alaska Native people, Native Hawaiians, going back to the beginning of this country. Secretary Holland launched the Federal Indian Boarding School initiative in 2021 after the discovery or rediscovery of a mass grave at the Kamloops boarding school in Canada, which prompted an immediate response from Indian people here in the United States for an accounting for our history of assimilationist boarding schools. And Secretary Holland responded, and I just want to also emphasize this point. It wasn't weeks or months or years of internal briefings and deliberating, should we do something about this? It was weeks. That Kamloops grave was discovered in April, I believe it was, of 2021, and it was early May, and by the middle of June of that year, Secretary Holland was launching the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative. And that, I think, those of you who've worked around government know, the government doesn't order paper in 6 weeks. So to launch something this historic in that time speed, I think speaks to the moral clarity and leadership that Secretary Holland has provided. And that initiative involves several parts, but that includes an investigative report. We have published Volume 1 of the Federal Indian Boarding School Report in 2022, and we will soon be publishing a second volume of that report. And for generations, as many of you who've had a chance to read that work, which Joaquin, by the way, was the principal drafter of that Volume 1 report and has done a lot of work to lead this historic effort. Those of you who understand this know that Native children were taken from their families hundreds or even thousands of miles away, sometimes too often, never to see them again. They were forced to change their names, cut their hair, throw out their clothes, prohibited from practicing their religion, engaging in manual labor, in some places through what was called an outing program. Wealthy families and communities near boarding schools could literally go to the boarding school and check out an Indian kid, like a library book, to come do domestic work in their home for free. Kids, and they were kids, endured all manner of abuse at these schools, all in the name of making Indian people no more, which was a national policy of the US federal government. And it was an effort aimed at erasing us from this country's existence. And so through this work, we've created the first official list of boarding schools that receive federal funding. We've identified dozens of marked and unmarked graves associated with those schools. And we've launched a permanent oral history collection so that living people today, history is not always past, living people today can share with the world their experiences at these boarding schools and make that part of our national record to educate people of what was once a long-standing national policy. The second volume of our report will serve as a roadmap for how we're going to continue to make this national record and also seek to chart a path forward for all of us on how to heal from the modern day impacts of those boarding schools and how Indian people today are living with the impacts of choices made here in this building and across the street many years ago. And I'm really looking forward to getting that report out into the public and also compiling the oral histories that so many people are bravely sharing with us, many for the first time, telling their story, and making sure that this never happens again here or anywhere else. Third, this administration is also standing up against threats to well-settled legal principles and important federal laws aimed at fulfilling our trust relationship. One of those, as Larry mentioned, was the Holland versus Brackeen case, attacking the constitutionality of the Indian Child Welfare Act. As a recovering tribal chairman and recovering lawyer, I also, it was galling to me that there would be that it was even debatable that Congress can pass all these laws, the executive branch can exercise these lawful government powers, because the courts upheld all these boarding school things, that all of this was lawful. So Congress can do the government can do all this terrible stuff and have the power to do this, but it wouldn't have the power to fix it or have the power to stop it, which is what ICWA really was all about. And I actually, for the very first time, went to the Supreme Court to listen to oral arguments in the Brackeen case. And it was only scheduled to go for about an hour, and I think we were there for over 3 hours. And during that hearing, judges from across the ideological spectrum were mentioning the work that the administration has done on the Indian Boarding School Initiative and their questioning of the attorneys on the Indian Child Welfare Act. And in a 7-2 opinion authored by Justice Barrett, the court reaffirmed that the federal government's plenary power over Indian affairs includes the legal reality that Indian status is political and that ICWA is constitutional. In this case, I think also, Larry mentioned how many tribes and organizations were involved. It shows the importance of teamwork between the federal government and tribes. I'm not that old, but I'm not that young anymore either. And in my lifetime, this was the best example of coordination between tribes and the federal government around or protecting Indian law that I had ever seen. And it also shows the importance of working across ideologies. Justice Gorsuch wrote one of the best concurring opinions I think I've ever read. And Justice Gorsuch, by the way, does Indian law better than a lot of people who practice Indian law. He really gets it right. And he cites Volume 1 of our Federal Indian Boarding School Report multiple times in his concurring opinion. And the effect is that it remains true that tribes have the power to protect our children from predatory foster care and adoption practices and make sure that our continued existence as Indian people is secured for another generation. And another part of our work in protecting tribal sovereignty, in protecting established legal precedents, we can see in some of these cases now coming out of Oklahoma, where people are trying to diminish tribal sovereignty and jurisdiction, whether that's the Murphy case or McGirt or Castro Huerta. We are working hard to show the federal judiciary why upholding the canons of construction are not only legally sound, but proper policy required to revitalize Indian country from centuries of territorial loss at the hands of the federal government and states. And the fourth way that I mentioned that we're working to carry out and really advance our trust obligation is to add lands back to the tribal land base, to expand tribal homelands and make sure that Indian people have a place to call home. So if you look at, a lot of people study about what is the federal trust responsibility to Indian people. And there's always, people try to nuance it and people try to qualify it. The courts you got to have this money. The Congress has to say there's no trust relationship unless Congress is spending money. But at its core, the trust responsibility means that the United States has committed itself to protecting the existence of Indian people as Indian people. And so when you're going to protect the existence of Indian people as Indian people, you got to protect their kids, right? So we have another generation of Indian people. And you got to protect the lands where Indian people live and call home. Not only for economic development, but because to be Indian, to be tribal, inherently involves a different type of connection to your homelands. That's what it means to be indigenous. It's not just a place where you develop a house or develop a business or have real estate. It's inextricably tied to your identity as Indian people. And so it is our federal trust obligation to not only protect tribal homelands, but to make sure that we're restoring tribal homelands to the lands that we committed to protecting in the first place. And so the Department of the Interior, along with USDA and the Department of Commerce, have launched this joint secretarial order on co-management and co-stewardship to manage, where tribes participate in the management of federal lands, national parks, wildlife refuges, and the like, because those lands were Indian lands at one point. We have changed our regulations to make it easier to put land into trust for the first time since the Indian Reorganization Act was passed almost 100 years ago. And for the first time, we are putting land into trust for tribes in Alaska. And I'm really proud that we've done that and that we're standing up to defend those decisions right now, and we're going to keep going. Also, we are taking money that the president has invested in Indian country to support community-led relocation efforts for tribes that are facing impacts from climate change today. I've had a chance to visit a number of those communities, the Quinault tribe in Washington, the village of Napakiak up in Alaska, the Fort Yukon tribe up in Alaska, to make sure that we're doing our part. Tribes did not cause climate change, but they're often at the forefront of dealing with the impacts, and that we're putting our money where our mouth is when it comes to protecting those communities and making sure they have what they need to withstand those impacts. So those are four of the ways that we're working to carry out and fulfill our trust responsibility. And I want to make sure that I close by adding, that one of the ways that we have to make sure this work continues is through engagement with young people and students, and also making sure that they're participating in our political process and that we're protecting their fundamental right to vote so that they can play a role in this work in the coming generations and stand upon our shoulders. We've been doing that by trying to make sure that we are designating places as voter registration sites. And so at Haskell Indian Nations University, which is in Lawrence, Kansas, along with Southwestern Indian Polytechnic, or SIPI, in Albuquerque, that those are voter registration sites for students from all across Indian country. And it's true that the vote in this country has historically been used to harm Indian country. And in some places, like Montana and Utah and the Dakotas, there are still people trying to do that through gerrymandering and voter suppression efforts. But we also see strong results when the vote is used to lift up Indian people, to lift up public servants from Indian country. Not only does it benefit Indian people, it benefits the United States by bringing all people into our system of government. And so I'm really proud of that work. It's work that we must continue, and I'm really grateful for all of you sharing in that effort. Miigwech, thank you. I look forward to answering some questions you guys might have. I've been saying that a lot at these hearings.
It's wonderful to sort of come to the end of the day on a sense of inspiration and hope with what is next. As our tradition, there's cards around if you've got a question. Let me just start with one kind of overarching question. Now that we have really focused on the historical treaties and the fact that these treaties exist but they haven't been honored, how does that fit into your work trying to, be a agent of the federal government, and we've got some treaties out there that we're not honoring so well?
You want to go?
I'll let you take that one first.
Oh, all right. I have 2 kids. One of them is just finished his sophomore year in college at Michigan State. And I have a daughter who's graduating high school here in a couple weeks. And they both, they'll razz me, but with some, a real edge to it about, working for the feds. And what it's being a native working for the federal government. And we talk about treaties at home. One of the things I take from those conversations with my own kids and people in my community is that these, for Indian people, treaties aren't a historic thing. They're binding law. And the last time I read the Constitution, it's binding law in the United States too. And one of the things we're trying to do, and it's always a struggle, is to make sure that we're not only reading the treaties defensively as what should the federal government not do, but that the affirmative obligations in those treaties are things that we should be carrying out, and to not read those treaties in a mechanical way, a literal, originalist, strict textualist way, because those treaties, as I think everyone knows, when they were negotiated, one side did not speak the language that the treaty was negotiated in. I had an opportunity to go to the National Archives once to read my tribe's treaties, and they showed me where the treaty was changed between the time it left the negotiating table and was presented to the Senate. So the treaties were changed unilaterally. And so we've got to make sure that in our work in the federal government, we're not viewing these treaties as just these old documents that have no meaning, and that they're not just defensive documents to protect tribes. They're the backbone of our relationship with tribes, and that we have affirmative obligations, and that we're not, if a treaty is saying, the federal government agrees to provide one teacher to a tribe, that we're not reading that as, okay, we've only got to pay for one teacher. The goal was education, because in 1850, one teacher taught a whole community of people. And so we can't read these things literally, and it's a challenge, because attorneys in the federal government and courts, especially as we get further away from the time those treaties were negotiated, want to read those words literally. But you have to read them in the way that the tribes understand them. And that's not a moral calling, that is actually the law as the Supreme Court has held for more than a century. And so it's a long, winding answer, but the point is that these are living documents that have relevance today and instruction for us today in carrying out federal responsibilities.
I've got a question that I don't understand, so y'all maybe could help me with this. The 2023 NAGPRA updates were long overdue. And what may be another piece of legislation that may be updated? Now, first, for the uninitiated, what is NAGPRA?
That's the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act.
Ah, okay. So those updates are done. Is there another piece of legislation that we ought to be looking at? What's the next piece that we ought to attend to?
That's a great question with no simple answer. They say, well, when people say, what are the priorities? Well, when everything is, we're still playing catch up after all these years to the point of making sure that this country honors the treaty and trust responsibility and lives up to those treaties. And that still isn't happening. And so when you say, well, what's a priority? When everything, when we're playing that catch up, everything's a priority. But I would say one thing, as we are commemorating the anniversary of the Snyder Act, is the Native American Voting Rights Act. And as you talk about, there's some locations where for a tribal member to go vote, they got to go take a 2-hour drive just to get to the polling place, because they won't allow those polling places within the reservation boundaries, and the way and recognizing that tribal sovereignty and the reservation, they may not have a postal address, they have a location, and they won't recognize that. And so making sure that here we are, the 100th anniversary of being a citizen with the right to vote, and we still don't have full voting rights or full access to be able to vote. And so, those processes are still happening to continue to make that harder. And you heard earlier with NARF and Mr. Echohawk having to actually go in and sue just for that basic right. And so I think, and as elections become more and more important, especially for Indian country, and as I said, we need to, our people need to be aware of the issues and what's going to affect Indian country most. And when they're being disenfranchised and unable to vote, that really has an impact, especially in states that have a high populations of natives, and they change the vote. And we've seen that in the last 2 national elections, and states like Arizona, Wisconsin, I'm sorry, I went blank, but North Dakota, yes, thank you. But when that impact is there, and to work to keep us out and not be able to exercise that right, for us, that's a very big thing. And so we want to make sure that we push to get that law passed, so we do have full voting rights and access to the polls.
So what do you think it would take? One of the things that has been a recurring theme today is this is a history that has not been told. This is a history that is not well known. What would it take to include the true history of Native Americans in the curriculum of our schools?
Yeah, I mean, as a ex-social studies teacher, you can look across the country, and really the last time you really hear about Native issues, truly Native issues, is you hear about Wounded Knee as it closes out the 1800s. And we have over 100 years of actions that the federal government's taken and that have affected tribes, and we don't teach that at all. And very few, unless you have select teachers who incorporate that into their curriculum, and just as an add-on, we don't see that. And you might get a class in college, and really that's a specialty. And unless you're taking a program that is focused on Native issues, but in high school, just from my experience, we just don't see that. And so for me, I had the opportunity. I was tribal chairman at the time too, and so when I taught my civics classes and government classes, I was able to work that in. And I had a student say, why do we need to learn this? And I said, because somebody in this room, one day, believe it or not, whether you think you're going to do it or not, is you're going to be elected to something. You're going to decide to run. You might be a mayor. You might sit on the local city council. You might you might be a governor, state legislature, or U.S. congressperson. I said, and when you get into that position, that is not the first time you should be hearing about Native issues, because I don't want to elect you to it if you're not thinking about how that affects our Native people. And so it is about education and making sure that we do what we can to bolster that, but it's going to be a very, very tough thing when we continue to see cutbacks in different things. But it truly is important because as you hear here today, sometimes this is the first time you hear it, and some of us have been doing this for a while. I'm in that old stage now too. I've been 20 plus years doing so, but again, in my own conversation with the governor, and she says, I didn't know that. I mean, it's basic law, and so that will continue to be an issue.
Thank you, Larry, and I co-sign everything you just said. When, as part of our boarding school initiative, Secretary Holland and I visited different communities across the country and did these listening sessions with people who went to boarding schools and their family members. And they were really powerful and emotional. And it was very difficult every time to sit and listen to people talk about the worst things that had ever happened in their lives. And I remember at one of these, we were at Rosebud, South Dakota, at one of these listening sessions, and we were driving back to Rapid City after, and one of the people who works at the Department of the Interior, who was traveling with us, was really upset on the ride back and had said, I never knew. I never knew. Nobody ever taught me any of this. This was a grown person who works at the Department of the Interior. Said, I never knew that anything like this happened in our country or that it was federal policy. And so it's going to take a concerted amount of effort to make sure it's part of our education. But the flip side of that is, I mentioned my son. He's studying to become a teacher at Michigan State, which has got a really good teaching program. And it was earlier this year, at the start of the spring semester, I got a text from him while I was at work, and it was a picture of the screen in his class, his teaching class at Michigan State. And up on the screen was the cover of the Federal Indian Boarding School report that had my name on it. Oh. And I talked to him about it, and he said that it wasn't like Native Studies class. This was his teaching class. That he said that day was about using that work as an example of how to incorporate truthful parts or the truth about our history into the teaching of history for high school students. And it was made me really proud, and I immediately shared it with Joaquin because he's done so much of the work on this initiative. So we have on the one hand people who are just shocked and floored when they hear the truth, but now we've got, despite all the stuff you see, people talking about nonsense about what people should and shouldn't know, we see teacher schools teaching kids how to learn about this stuff and then how to teach about it when they get into the classroom. And I think that's a positive thing, but it's going to require that on a large scale.
Well, I'll give you one encouraging spot, is that a component of our work from this symposium is to create lesson plans that will be available on our virtual hub of learning tools. So we're trying to do a little piece in this.
Thank you.
Okay, we are at the end of our time, and so this is a great last question. So for each of you, you have been doing this work. It's been difficult, it's been tireless. There have been some moments when you have probably, put your head down and said, what am I doing? What are some things that you can say right now, this is what I will remember that I did that made a difference? Larry, you want to start?
Yes, sure. How do you answer that question? I think twofold, I think, for me, being a tribal chairman with my tribe and knowing our history, and, to just start with my father, in his time, he was born Ponca, and he's also Rosebud Sioux, but in his time, my grandmother, his mother's tribe, she was Ponca. And in his time, he was born Ponca and then told he wasn't Indian. And to live through that and be there, I was born not Ponca. Ponca didn't exist. And in 1990, when we got reinstated, to know that he saw that full circle, and my children were born Ponca, and to see the work that my elders and those that came before me did until I came into office in 2002, and then to see how much we've grown based on that. And when you look, really, truly rebuilding a tribal nation, and to be part of that is something I'll always be proud of. And it's really helped me transition to this role, knowing that we have 574 federally recognized tribes that NCAI represents. And they're all going, we're not monolithic. We all have similar issues, but we all have our specific issues that we deal with. And to bring that collective voice together and know that that's what NCAI represents, and to be part of that is something I'm very honored to be in and do. And so I tell my staff, and they probably get tired of hearing it, but both of those for me, I get to do this. We get to do this work on behalf of our people, and that's a privileged few, and to be in that position, I always say there's never a dull day, and there's always something going on, but when you get to bring that together and work with so many amazing people across the agencies, different programs, people that want to help Indian country, work on behalf of Indian country, and be part of that collective effort is really humbling and just an honor to be part of.
Bryan.
I'm going to share I promise they will be brief. Not a lawyer telling you it's going to be brief and then not. Just two things. First, people say when you sign up for jobs like tribal leadership or you work for the government, it's thankless, and I have found that to be just unequivocally false. It's hard to come up with examples of when you get to see people express their gratitude for the work that you get to be a part of, because it's meaningful to people's lives, and it's been an honor to do this. A year and a half ago, I was up at the Fond du Lac Band in Minnesota for an event to return a piece of land along Lake Superior. It was actually over the border in Wisconsin, and so the governors of both states were there. There were senators, and this was a former burial site that was taken from the tribe in the early 1900s, so that the city of Superior, Wisconsin could engage in waterfront development and build a big shipping pier. And it was very painful for the tribe. And then the graves were dug up and moved, and many of them were never found again. And so that land was returned back to the tribe, and just the joy and the feeling of being at this big celebration of how, even though everybody there had not been born when that had happened, the sense of pain is still real for people, and just the feeling of joy and the dancing, and it was just a very joyful experience. And I'll never forget Chairman Dupe from the tribe spoke up, and he said, our land always seems to disappear with the stroke of a pen, and it always takes us decades or centuries to get just a piece of it back. And but how meaningful that work was, that he had continued on what had been begun by many of his predecessors. So that was rewarding. The second is, in this job, I try to make sure that I'm visiting communities that don't get people in high-ranking government positions. I know what it's like to come from a tribe that is way out of the way, where people just don't come to. And we visited Alaska and did a tour of 7 or 8 different villages. I remember we flew into this community in Southwest Alaska called St. Mary's. You can only get there by plane or by boat. And it was early in 2022, and we were going to spend the night there in this little dorm. And they had the community meeting, and I remember the tribal leader there said that he was really embarrassed that they couldn't feed us. And as those of you who've been around Indian country know, that's customary for almost all tribes, is when you have visitors, you feed them. But he had said that because of a number of factors, including climate change, they hadn't caught a king salmon in their river in years, and that they were facing a food crisis, and that they had no food to feed us. And we said, you don't need to be embarrassed. We're embarrassed that we've put you in this position. And so our meetings ended. They had a community dance, impromptu. They invited us to that night, and there was singing and dancing. And it just felt really good. And we went back to our dorm where we were staying, and it was getting ready for bed, and there was a knock on the door. And there was this guy who had been around all day, hadn't said much, and he had a plastic bag with 4 dried strips of king salmon. And based on what we had heard all day, those had come out of somebody's food store in their house. They'd probably been saving those for years, but they wanted to share it with us. Even though they're mad at the federal government, they're dealing with all these impacts that, like, taking away all the food that they have and just wreaking havoc on their way of life. They still wanted to share what little they had. And I will never, ever forget that. And working in this town, you can become cynical, you can become disillusioned, you can certainly become exhausted and kind of forget, why are you doing this stuff? And I think back to that moment, when that quiet man offered a piece of what little he had because he felt it important to share. That's why we do this work.
We do.
Thank you.
Well, the two of you are extraordinary leaders, and we are so grateful for you being with us. As we come to a close, I do want to take a moment to thank the staff of the United States Capitol Historical Society. You sort of put it in. Stand up, stand up, stand up. Jasmine, Charisse, you met Sam and Katie, who worked particularly hard on this, but you knew about this event because Jasmine Perry sent out the newsletter, and you will get a newsletter with a link to the recording so that you can share that with your folks. There's also going to be a short survey so that we can look at what might be our next follow-on activities. We are also always have to be grateful to those partners who allowed us to do this. Wells Fargo, our presenting partner, the Chickasaw Nation, McGuire Woods. Thank you all. And as is our tradition, we have a small gift for each of you, which is a paperweight that is a replica of the Capitol, made from marble from the Capitol.
Oh, wow.
Fits under the congressional gift bag.
Thank you so much.
So thank you all very much for being with us. We are so grateful for your time and your attention. We hope that you will go from this place